Chapter 1. The Silence of Fangorn. There's a sound in Fangorn Forest that most people never hear. Not the creaking of ancient branches in the wind, not the whisper of leaves speaking languages older than men. Something deeper. The sound of trees thinking. Merry Brandybuck sits with his back against Treebeard's massive root foot, listening to that slow, deep rumble that might be breath or might be thought, and he understands with growing horror that the sound is fading. The Entmoot is ending, and they're saying no. What if the Ents, in their ancient wisdom, decided that the war between the quick-speaking peoples was not their concern? What if Treebeard, after 3 days of deliberation that felt like 3 centuries to hobbit hearts, looked down at Merry and Pippin with eyes like deep wells, and spoke the words that would reshape the fate of Middle-earth? We will not march to war. The morning mist clings to the forest floor as Treebeard's voice echoes through the gathering of his kind, each word falling like stones into still water. Merry feels Pippin tense beside him, the younger hobbit's fingers digging into the moss-covered ground. They've been here for 3 days now, listening to the Ents debate in their impossibly slow speech, watching hope build and crumble with each passing hour. The destruction they witnessed from Fangorn's borders still burns in their minds, the white hand of Saruman carved into living trees, the smoke rising from Isengard's forges, the mechanical thunder of industry drowning out the song of growing things. But the trees, Pippin whispers, his voice breaking on the words. He's destroying everything. Treebeard's great eyes settle on him, and there's an ancient sadness there that makes Merry's chest tight. Little hasty one, the Ent says, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. We have seen wars come and go like seasons. Men fight, men die, men are replaced by other men. But if we march to war, if we spend ourselves in this battle of the quick speakers, his pause stretches long enough for moss to grow, it seems to Merry. Who will guard the forests when we are gone? The logic is sound, Merry realizes with a sick feeling in his stomach. It's the logic of creatures who measure time in centuries, who have watched empires rise and fall while their roots grow deeper. The Ents are not cowards, they are gardeners, thinking always of what must be protected for tomorrow's tomorrow. But in this moment, as Merry watches Quickbeam's face fall and hears the rustle of disappointment through the gathered shepherds of the forest, that ancient wisdom feels like abandonment. He will not stop with a few trees, Merry says, standing despite the trembling in his legs. His voice sounds impossibly small in the vast quiet of Fangorn, but he pushes on. Saruman won't stop until everything is machinery and smoke, until there are no forests left to guard. The assembled Ents turn their attention to him with the slow, inevitable motion of mountains shifting. Treebeard leans down until his bark-lined face is level with Merry's, and the hobbit can smell the deep earth scent of him, can feel the warmth of something that has grown steady and strong for thousands of years. Young sprout, Treebeard says, and his voice is not unkind. Do you know how many wars we have been asked to join? How many causes have seemed worth our sacrifice? If we spend ourselves now, who will be left to refuse the next call? It's the question that has no good answer, and Merry knows it. In the silence that follows, he hears the truth that will echo through everything that comes after. The Ents are too precious to lose, too ancient to risk, too few to spend on any cause but the very last. They will retreat deeper into their forests, tend their groves, and let the world of men and wizards settle its own affairs. It's the right choice for the Ents, and it may well be the wrong choice for Middle-earth. But that's a reckoning that lies ahead, in battles yet to be fought, and choices yet to be made. For now, there is only the slow dispersal of the Entmoot, the ancient creatures returning to their individual domains with the ponderous dignity of living mountains. Merry and Pippin stand alone in the clearing as the last of them disappear between the trees, carrying with them the last hope of easy victory against Saruman's growing power. The silence that follows is different from the thoughtful quiet of the Entmoot. This is the silence of opportunity dying, of paths not taken crystallizing into permanent roads. From somewhere in the distance comes the sound that Merry has learned to dread, the rhythmic pounding of Saruman's machinery, uninterrupted by Ent fury, unbroken by root and branch and righteous anger. The White Wizard's forges burn on, his armies grow unchecked, and the sound of trees thinking has faded to a whisper. 3 days later, when Gandalf the White arrives at the borders of Fangorn expecting to find Isengard in ruins, he instead finds 2 hobbits sitting by the forest's edge, staring across the gap toward a fortress that stands intact and more terrible than ever. The wizard's face, when he realizes what the silence means, is something neither hobbit will ever forget. "They said no," Merry says simply, and watches as understanding and something that might be despair pass across Gandalf's features like clouds across the sun. But that conversation, and the words that will follow, belong to what comes next. For now, there is only the decision that has been made, and the sound of Saruman's victory echoing across the empty miles where Entregi should have been. The trees of Fangorn continue their slow thinking, deep in the heart of the forest, where time moves differently, and the quick speakers beyond their borders must face what comes without them. The war will go on. The ring will continue its journey toward Mount Doom. Heroes will rise, and some will fall, and the fate of Middle-earth will hang in balances more delicate than anyone yet knows. But it will all unfold in a world where the Ents chose wisdom over rage, preservation over sacrifice, and left the children of Eru to face the darkness with whatever strength they can find in themselves. There's something fitting about that, Merry thinks, as he watches the smoke rise from Isengard's untouched towers, something that speaks to the deep structure of choices and consequences that governs all growing things. But understanding the fitness of it doesn't make the smoke smell any less like burning hope, or make the sound of Saruman's hammers any easier to bear. Chapter 2. The Untested Fortress. There's a sound that Saruman has never heard before, echoing through the halls of Orthanc, the sound of 10,000 Uruk-hai breathing in perfect unison. Not the ragged gasps of a force depleted by sudden battle, not the diminished ranks of survivors regrouping after unexpected defeat. All of them. Every warrior bred in the caverns below, every pike-bearer forged in the fires of his furnaces, every crossbow wielder trained in the arts of siege warfare. They stand in the great courtyard of Isengard as the pale light of March forth filters through the smoke of his forges, and for the first time since he took the title of Saruman, of many colors, the White Wizard allows himself to feel something approaching satisfaction. The messenger's report still crinkles in his iron-gloved hand. Theoden King rides for Helm's Deep with perhaps 3,000 men, women, and children of Edoras. 3,000 frightened refugees seeking shelter in an ancient fortress that was old when Isengard was young. Saruman crushes the parchment slowly, savoring the texture of paper yielding beneath metal, and begins to calculate. 7,000 to break Helm's Deep. More than enough to overwhelm any defense Theoden might mount. More than sufficient to drive the lesson home to any who might think to oppose the new order he will bring to these lands. But 3,000 he will keep in reserve, here in Isengard, tending the forges and preparing for larger campaigns. Because Saruman has learned something in his centuries of study that Sauron, in his blind hunger, has forgotten. The wisest conqueror is the one who never commits his entire force to a single battle. He descends the steps of Orthanc with the measured pace of inevitability itself, his white robes pristine against the industrial sprawl of his domain. The Uruk-hai part before him, like a black sea, their yellow eyes reflecting the fires that burn day and night in his foundries. At their head stands Ugluk, the largest and fiercest of their kind, scarred from a dozen battles and hungry for a dozen more. "My lord Saruman," Ugluk growls, his voice like grinding stone. The man-flesh huddles in their stone burrow. "When do we feast?" "Soon," Saruman replies, and his voice carries across the courtyard with the weight of prophecy. "But hear me well, all of you. This is not merely about conquest. This is about demonstration. When Helm's Deep falls, and it will fall, every stronghold in Rohan will understand that walls offer no protection from the might of Isengard. Every king will know that resistance brings only death." The Uruk-hai roar their approval, a sound like avalanches breaking loose from mountain peaks. But Saruman raises his staff for silence, and silence comes instantly. This is the discipline that sets his forces apart from Sauron's numberless hordes, not mere savagery, but savagery directed by intelligence. 7,000 of you will march with Ugluk," he continues. "The rest remain here, ready for what comes after. We are not gamblers throwing everything on a single cast of the dice. We are builders of empire, and empires require patience." The division happens with mechanical precision. 7,000 Uruk-hai form ranks that stretch across Isengard's courtyard, their armor gleaming dull in the forge light, their weapons held with the casual readiness of born killers. The remaining 3,000 array themselves around the walls and foundries, ready to defend what Saruman has built, while their brothers carry his power beyond Isengard's borders. But there's something else in Saruman's calculation, something he keeps to himself as he watches his army prepare to march. Intelligence suggests that Gandalf has returned, Gandalf the White, somehow restored and more powerful than before. If the Grey Pilgrim seeks to interfere, as he surely will, the Wizard of Isengard wants forces in reserve to deal with that particular complication. The Ents may have chosen neutrality, but Gandalf never learned the wisdom of restraint. Miles away, in the pre-dawn darkness before Helm's Deep, King Theoden stands on the ancient battlements and watches the stars fade into grey morning light. The fortress around him hums with desperate activity. Men sharpening weapons they hope they'll never need to use. Women preparing bandages for wounds not yet suffered. Children helping with tasks too large for their small hands, because there's no one else left to do them. Aragorn finds him there, gazing out across the deeping wall toward the gap where the enemy will come. The ranger's face is drawn with exhaustion, and something deeper, the look of a man who has counted numbers and found them wanting. "How many?" Theoden asks without turning. "Perhaps 300 fighting men," Aragorn replies. "Elrond's sons brought word from the borders. Saruman's army numbers in the thousands. 7, perhaps 8,000 Uruk-hai, plus siege engines and scaling ladders. They march through the night and will be here by noon." Theoden's hands tighten on the stone parapet. In his younger days, he might have raged against such odds, might have called for a charge that would at least ensure they died, like kings rather than rats in a trap. But age has taught him the weight of other lives, and the people of Edoras sleep fitfully in the keep behind him, trusting him to find a way through this darkness. "We've held these walls before," he says finally, "against the Dunlendings, against the wild men of the mountains. Stone endures." "This is different," Aragorn says quietly. "Saruman's forces aren't raiders seeking plunder. They're an army built for one purpose: to break stone and kill everything behind it. They have the tools, the numbers, and the will to see it done." From somewhere in the darkness beyond the wall comes the sound that will haunt every defender's dreams, the measured tramp of thousands of feet moving in perfect unison. Not the scattered advance of raiders or the chaotic charge of wild men, but the disciplined march of professional killers who know exactly what they're about. Legolas appears beside them with the silent grace of his kind, his keen eyes already tracking movement in the distance. "They come as you said they would," he tells Aragorn. "But there's something else. Warg riders on the flanks, at least 100. And behind the main force," he pauses, his expression troubled, "siege towers. More than I can count." Gimli's voice carries up from below, where the dwarf oversees the placement of what few defences they've managed to prepare. "Let them come with their towers and their pretty formations. These walls were built by better folk than them, and by Durin's beard they'll hold." But even Gimli's defiance sounds hollow in the grey morning air, because they all know what the numbers mean, what the sight of those siege engines portends. Helm's Deep was built to withstand raiders and small armies, not the focused assault of 7,000 professional soldiers backed by the industrial might of Isengard. The mathematics are simple and brutal. They are outnumbered more than 20 to 1, and their walls, however ancient and proud, are still just stone. As the sun rises over the Hornburg, it illuminates a fortress that has never faced a test like this. For 3,000 years, these walls have stood against every threat the wild lands could offer. But they were built in a different age, for different wars, against enemies who fought with sword and spear and the occasional battering ram. Today, they will face the full, undiluted might of Saruman's vision, made manifest. 10,000 Uruk-hai, bred for war, equipped with weapons designed specifically to crack stone and slaughter defenders, led by creatures who know no fear and feel no mercy. It should have been 8,000. Perhaps 9, weakened by unexpected battle with tree shepherds, diminished by the loss of Isengard's defensive walls, forced to attack without the security of an intact base of operations. Instead, it is 7,000 at full strength, supported by 3,000 more in reserve, launching their assault from the unbreached fortress of Isengard itself. The difference, measured in lives that will be lost and blood that will be shed, is the space between hope and despair. The sound of Saruman's army grows louder with each passing moment, and on the walls of Helm's Deep, the last free people of Rohan prepare to discover what stone endures and what it cannot bear. Chapter 3. The Fall of the Hornburg. There's a moment, just before dawn on March 5th, when King Theoden's hand finds the worn groove in his sword's pommel, the same groove his father's thumb wore smooth and his father's father before him. It's such a small thing, this inheritance of touch, this continuity of purpose passed down through generations of kings who stood on these same walls and faced the darkness beyond them. But as 7,000 Uruk-hai surge up scaling ladders that bend under their weight, as the ancient stones of the deeping wall crack beneath the hammering of siege towers built in Saruman's forges, that small groove feels like the last solid thing in a world coming apart at the seams. The Battle of Helm's Deep has been raging for 6 hours now, and nothing has gone as it should. In the stories Theoden heard as a child, besieged fortresses held out for weeks, months even, grinding down attackers through sheer endurance and the advantage of height, but Saruman's army isn't following the old rules of warfare. They come with ladders that extend higher than the walls, crossbow bolts that punch through mail like parchment, and a coordination that speaks of months of drilling in Isengard's courtyards. The deeping wall, that ancient bulwark that has never been breached, shows 3 separate gaps now, each one widening as Uruk-hai pour through with their mattocks and iron-shod boots. Aragorn fights desperately at the largest breach, his sword Anduril cutting silver arcs through the torchlit darkness. But for every orc that falls, 2 more take its place. Legolas stands atop the wall above him, his arrows finding their marks with deadly precision, but even elvish accuracy cannot stem this tide. From his position in the keep's highest tower, Theoden watches Éomer marshal what remains of their cavalry in the courtyard below. Perhaps 40 riders, all that survive of the 300 who rode out from Edoras. The horses stamp and blow in the cold air, their breath visible in white clouds, their riders' faces set with the grim determination of men who know this is likely their last charge. "My lord," Gamling says, appearing at Theoden's shoulder. Blood streams from a gash across the old soldier's forehead, but his voice remains steady. "The outer defences are lost. If we're going to retreat to the keep's inner chambers—" "No." Theoden's voice carries the weight of absolute decision. "No more retreating. If Helm's Deep falls tonight, let it fall with a king upon its walls." He starts toward the stairs, but Gamling's hand catches his arm. "My lord, your people need you alive. If you die here—" "My people need their king to remember what kingship means," Theoden replies. "Sometimes that memory is worth more than the man who carries it." Down in the courtyard, Éomer raises his horn to his lips. The sound that emerges is pure and clear, cutting through the clash of weapons and the screams of the dying like a blade through silk. It's the horn call of the Rohirrim, the song of horses running free across endless grasslands, and every defender who hears it feels something straighten in their spine despite the hopelessness of their situation. "Forth Eorlingus!" Éomer cries, and 40 riders spur their horses toward the gap in the deeping wall. They know the mathematics as well as anyone. 40 horses against 7,000 orcs is not a charge but a gesture, not strategy, but statement. But sometimes statements matter more than survival, and sometimes the gesture is the point. They strike the Uruk-hai line like lightning hitting a mountain, brilliant, violent, and ultimately futile. Éomer's spear takes an orc through the chest, his sword opens throats and splits skulls, his horse's hooves cave in ribs and scatter enemies like leaves. For perhaps 30 heartbeats, it seems as though courage alone might be enough to turn the tide. Then the crossbow bolts begin to find their marks. Horses scream and fall, riders cry out as iron points punch through their mail, and what began as a charge becomes a slaughter. Éomer fights his way back toward the keep, perhaps a dozen men still with him, and even from the tower, Theoden can see the despair in his nephew's eyes as he realizes what this defeat means. That's when Theoden makes his choice. The king takes up his sword and shield and walks down the tower steps with the measured pace of a man going to meet his doom with dignity intact. In the great hall below, women and children huddle around whatever warmth they can find, their faces turned toward him with the terrible trust of people who believe their king can somehow make the impossible happen. "Stay here," he tells them. "Bar the doors behind me. When they break them down—" He pauses, searching for words that might carry some comfort. "Remember that we were here. Remember that we stood." The courtyard has become a charnel house, lit by the red glow of fires that burn throughout the fortress. Uruk-hai stream through every gap in the walls now, their yellow eyes gleaming with bloodlust, their weapons dripping with the lives of Rohan's defenders. Aragorn still fights near the largest breach, but he's been driven back almost to the keep itself, and even the strength of Númenor has limits. Theoden walks into this chaos with his sword raised and his shield set, and for a moment, just a moment, the nearest Uruk-hai pause. There's something about him, standing there in his ancient mail, with the golden horse of the mark emblazoned on his shield, that speaks to older laws than the ones Saruman has written. This is a king in his own hall, and even orcs can feel the weight of that authority. Then the moment breaks, and they surge forward. What follows is not a battle but a king's death, and there's a dignity in it that transcends the larger defeat surrounding it. Theoden's sword cuts down 3 Uruk-hai before a spear thrust pierces his side, and he kills 2 more even as his blood soaks into the ancient stones of his ancestors. When he finally falls, it's with his face toward his enemies, and his sword still in his hand. Aragorn reaches him just as the light fades from the old king's eyes. "I go to my fathers," Theoden whispers, "in whose mighty company I shall not now feel ashamed." And then he's gone, and with him dies something that can never be replaced, the last king of the Mark, the final voice that remembered when these lands knew peace. The sun rises over Helm's Deep as the last of the resistance crumbles, and what Gandalf sees when he arrives with Erkenbrand, and what few reinforcements he could gather, is a fortress fallen, its defenders scattered or dead, its walls breached in a dozen places. The White Wizard sits upon Shadowfax at the edge of the battlefield, his staff dark in his hand, and for the first time in any age, mortal or divine, Gandalf the Wise looks utterly defeated. "Too late," he says to the smoking ruins below. "We are too late." In the keep, Aragorn leads perhaps 200 survivors through passages that Gimli's knowledge of dwarf work revealed in the depths of the mountain. They escape into the dawn with their lives, but they leave behind something irreplaceable. The myth of the impregnable fortress, the belief that walls and courage might be enough to hold back the darkness. Saruman's victory is complete, total, and devastating. But more than that, it's the kind of victory that echoes through history, that breaks the spirit along with the stones. When word spreads that Helm's Deep has fallen, that King Theoden is dead, and the Hornburg lies in ruins, every remaining stronghold in Rohan will understand a simple truth. Nowhere is safe, no defense is strong enough, and the white hand of Saruman will reach them all in time. The morning wind carries smoke and the scent of defeat across the Westfold, and in Isengard, 3,000 Uruk-hai who never left their posts sharpen their weapons and wait for orders. The war is far from over, but its trajectory has changed forever in the pre-dawn darkness of a fortress that was supposed to stand until the world's end. Chapter 4. The White Hand Ascendant. There's a sound that Saruman has never made before, echoing through the breeding pits beneath Orthanc. Laughter, not the bitter, calculating amusement of a wizard who has outmaneuvered his enemies, not the cruel satisfaction of watching lesser beings destroy themselves for his entertainment. This is something deeper and more dangerous, the laughter of a creature who has just discovered that he might not need to serve anyone at all. The reports from Helm's Deep lie spread across his obsidian table like fallen leaves. Casualty counts, tactical assessments, lists of captured weapons and provisions. 7,000 Uruk-hai sent forth, 6,800 returned. In the space of a single night, he has proven what neither Sauron nor the wise seem to understand: that victory in this age belongs not to the largest army or the oldest magic, but to the one who thinks furthest ahead. Below him, in the spawning chambers carved from Isengard's living rock, A new generation of Uruk-hai struggles toward consciousness in pools of black water warmed by the heat of his forges. They are larger than their predecessors, bred with improvements suggested by the lessons of Helm's Deep, stronger arms for wielding heavier weapons, keener eyes for picking out targets in darkness, thicker skulls for surviving the kind of desperate resistance that killed 200 of his warriors in their moment of victory. But it's not the breeding that occupies Saruman's thoughts as he descends the spiral stairs toward his war chamber. It's the realization that has been growing in his mind since the moment Theoden King died on his own threshold. He no longer needs Sauron's victory to claim what he desires most. The ring, the precious, the one thing in all Middle-earth that could make him master not just of Rohan and Gondor, but of the Dark Lord himself. Sauron expects the White Hand to march its armies toward Minas Tirith, to join his own forces in the siege that will break Gondor's power forever. But Saruman has a different plan, forming in the depths of his calculating mind. While the Dark Lord spends his strength against Gondor's walls, while he commits his armies to a siege that may take months to resolve, the Ring-Bearer continues his journey through the wild lands between Ithilien and Mordor, with only a single companion and a treacherous guide. "Grishnak," Saruman calls, and one of his orc captains steps forward from the shadows. This one is different from the Uruk-hai, smaller, more cunning, bred for stealth rather than open battle. "How many of your scouts can move through Ithilien without being seen?" 50, maybe 60, Lord," the orc replies, his yellow eyes gleaming with anticipation. "The rangers of Gondor patrol there, but they're few, and they think in straight lines. My lads know how to use the shadows." "Then here is what you will do." Saruman moves to a map carved into the chamber's wall, his finger tracing paths through the wilderness east of the Anduin. The Ring-Bearer travels somewhere in this region, making his way toward Mordor. Small, probably traveling on foot, guided by one of the river folk. Find him, but do not take him. Not yet. Watch. Follow. When the moment comes, when he is far from any aid that Gandalf or his ranger friend might provide, then you will strike. And the ring, Lord? What do we do with it? Saruman's smile is cold enough to freeze summer. You will bring it to me, here in Isengard, where neither Sauron nor the White Council can reach it, and then we will see who truly rules Middle-earth. 3 days' march southeast of Isengard, in the green hills of Ithilien, where spring comes early and the air still carries the scent of growing things, Frodo Baggins crouches behind a fallen log and tries very hard not to think about how exposed they are. The land here is beautiful in a way that makes his heart ache. Wild roses blooming in hedgerows, clear streams chattering over stone, ancient trees spreading their branches wide in groves that might have been gardens once, before the shadow fell across them. But beauty in this place has become a trap, because beauty makes you want to trust the world around you, and trust is a luxury that ring-bearers cannot afford. "We shouldn't be here in daylight," Sam whispers, his hand resting on the hilt of Sting. "These lands crawl with men and orcs alike, according to our guide." He casts a dark look toward Gollum, who hunches a dozen paces away, his pale eyes scanning the horizon with the nervous attention of a creature that has survived too long by expecting the worst. "Smeagol knows the safe paths," Gollum hisses back, "but hasty hobbits make noise, leave tracks. Better to rest in daylight, travel in darkness when the big folk sleep." Frodo adjusts the weight of the ring on its chain around his neck, feeling its familiar warmth against his chest. Every step toward Mordor makes it heavier, makes its whispers louder. And lately those whispers have taken on a new urgency. Something has changed in the world beyond this green sanctuary. Some shift in the balance of power that the ring can sense, even if its bearer cannot understand what it means. That's when they hear it. The sound of iron-shod boots on stone, coming from the direction of the old Roman road that cuts through these hills like a scar across time. Not the scattered footfalls of rangers moving through their territory, not the careful advance of Gondorian patrols. This is the measured tramp of soldiers who know exactly where they're going. Gollum's eyes go wide with terror. "White Hand," he hisses. "Saruman's scouts. They hunt. Yes, they hunt. Looking for the precious." "That's impossible," Sam says, but his voice lacks conviction. "Saruman's forces are in Rohan, fighting the Horse Lords. How could they be here?" Frodo doesn't answer, because he's begun to understand something that chills him more than the touch of Nazgul or the proximity of Mordor's borders. The ring's weight has been increasing, not just because they're getting closer to its creation place, but because something else is hunting it now. Something with power and will, enough to make even Sauron's artifact take notice. They press themselves deeper into the shadows as the patrol passes, 20 Uruk high in the black armor of Isengard, moving with the purposeful efficiency of hunters who know their prey is somewhere near. Their leader carries a banner that Frodo has never seen before, the White Hand, but changed somehow, no longer subordinate to the eye of Sauron, but standing alone against a field of deepest black. "They're spreading out," Sam observes, as the patrol begins to fan across the hillside below their hiding place. "Searching, looking for something specific. Looking for us," Frodo says quietly. "Somehow, they know we're here." The hunt that follows is a game of cat and mouse played across the rolling hills of Ithilien, with stakes higher than any game in history. Frodo and Sam move like ghosts through groves and stream beds, following paths that Gollum claims to remember from his long years of wandering, always staying just ahead of the White Hand patrols that seem to be everywhere now. It's Faramir who finds them first, appearing out of a thicket with his rangers like grey shadows given form. The captain of Gondor's face is grim with news that offers no comfort to anyone. "The White Hand has come to Ithilien," he tells them, as his men keep watch from the surrounding trees. Dozens of patrols, all searching for something they will not name. Our watchers report similar activity throughout the region, orcs in the livery of Isengard, asking questions of captured travelers, offering rewards for information about small folk traveling alone. "They seek the ring," Frodo says simply, "because there's no point in denying what they all understand now." Faramir's eyes widen slightly, but he recovers quickly. "Then you must leave this place immediately. My rangers can escort you to safer paths, but we cannot hide you from an army. Saruman has sent hundreds of scouts into these lands, and they search with purpose." As if summoned by his words, the sound of hunting horns echoes across the hills, not the sweet note of Gondorian signals, but the harsh bray of Uruk-hai calling to their scattered companions. The net is closing, and everyone in this hidden dell knows it. "There's something else," Faramir continues, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Word has come from our spies in the east. Saruman no longer answers Sauron's summons. The White Wizard has declared himself free of all allegiances, save his own ambition. If he claims the ring—" He doesn't finish the thought, because they all understand what it means. A war between Dark Lords, with the ring as the prize, and Middle-earth as the battlefield where their conflict will be settled. No victors in such a war, only degrees of defeat for everyone who still believes in light. In the distance, the hunting horns sound again, closer now, and Frodo feels the ring's weight increase until it seems it might drag him down through the earth itself. Somewhere in the fortress of Isengard, Saruman of many colors sits in his tower and calculates the odds of claiming ultimate power. And those odds, based on what has happened at Helm's Deep and what continues to unfold across the borderlands of Gondor, are better than they have ever been before. The hunt continues, and the hunters grow stronger with each passing hour. Chapter 5. The Fractured Alliance. There's a silence that has never existed before in the halls of Orthanc, the silence of a servant who has stopped listening for his master's voice. Saruman stands at the great window of his tower, gazing out across the industrial sprawl of Isengard, and for the first time in centuries, the palantir behind him sits dark and unused. The seeing stone that once bound him in constant communication with Barad-dûr now rests beneath a cloth of black silk, its surface no longer rippling with the Dark Lord's commands and demands. In the distance, the forges of his realm burn bright against the morning sky, their smoke rising in pillars that speak of production, unconstrained by outside interference. 3,000 Uruk-hai drill in the courtyard below, their movements precise as clockwork, while in the spawning pits beneath the tower, a new generation of warriors quickens toward birth, all of it his, all of it growing stronger with each passing day, all of it free. The messenger arrives as Saruman knew it would, not through the gates of Isengard, but through darker paths that bypass the physical world entirely. The temperature in the chamber drops by degrees until frost begins to form on the obsidian surfaces, and when Saruman turns from the window, he is no longer alone. The mouth of Sauron stands in the center of the room, like a wound in reality itself. Tall and terrible in black armor that seems to drink the light from the air around it. His face hidden behind a helm wrought with symbols that hurt to look upon directly. When he speaks, his voice carries the weight of the Dark Lord's will, and that weight has crushed stronger spirits than any who have dared to defy it. Saruman the White, the lieutenant says, though the title carries mockery now, twisted into something that sounds more like accusation than recognition. My master grows impatient. The assault on Minas Tirith begins in 4 days, and your armies are not where they belong. And where, precisely, do they belong? Saruman's voice carries a new note, not the careful deference he once showed to Sauron's representatives, but something approaching amusement. Have I missed some summons? Some command issued through proper channels? Your 10,000 were promised to the siege. The southern approaches to Gondor's capital require securing, and your forces were designated for that task. Why do they still sit idle in Isengard when they should be marching toward their assigned positions? Saruman moves to his desk, where maps of Middle-earth spread across polished stone show the current disposition of forces across the theater of war. His finger traces the borders of Rohan, now shaded in the colors of conquest, then moves east toward the great city that has stood unconquered for 3,000 years. Perhaps, he says slowly, because I have found a more profitable use for them. The silence that follows is colder than the frost on the walls, colder than the wind that howls through the gap of Rohan in winter's deepest grip. The mouth of Sauron stands motionless, but there's something in his stillness that speaks of violence barely contained, of power gathering like storm clouds on a summer's horizon. Explain. The ring, my dear lieutenant. The precious thing that your master desires above all others. While he spends his armies breaking stones and slaughtering soldiers, the ring-bearer continues his journey toward the very heart of Mordor. Unguarded, vulnerable, ready for the taking by anyone clever enough to reach him first. The mouth of Sauron takes a step forward, and the air around him shimmers with heat that has nothing to do with fire, and everything to do with the rage of his distant master. The ring-bearer will come to Mordor as the Dark Lord has foreseen. There he will be taken, and the ring restored to its rightful owner. Your interference in this design would be unwise. Would it? Saruman's smile is sharp as winter ice. How long has your master searched for the ring? How many centuries has he spent seeking what was lost? And now, when it travels almost undefended through the wild lands between here and there, he chooses to focus on what? Conquering a single city? Breaking a single kingdom? The wizard shakes his head with mock sadness. I had expected better strategic thinking from the Lord of Mordor. What happens next is not quite a battle, because battles require two forces of roughly equal power meeting in conflict. This is something else, the testing of wills, the measurement of strength against strength, the careful calculation of just how far rebellion can be pushed before it becomes outright war. The mouth of Sauron raises his gauntleted hand, and shadows gather around him like living things, reaching toward Saruman with tendrils that burn the very air they pass through. But the White Wizard is no longer the servant who once cowered before the Dark Lord's attention. His staff blazes with light that cuts through shadow like a blade through silk, and when he speaks a word in the black speech of Mordor, it carries authority that makes even Sauron's lieutenant pause. You forget yourself, Saruman, the mouth says. But there's uncertainty in his voice now, a recognition that something fundamental has shifted in the balance of power between them. No, Saruman replies, and his voice carries the weight of absolute conviction. I remember myself. For the first time in longer than you have existed, I remember exactly who and what I am. Saruman of many colors, first among the Astari, bearer of Narya the Red, master of the lore of ring-making. His eyes blaze with inner fire as he speaks. Did your master truly believe I would remain his servant forever? Did he think I could study the ring for centuries without learning something of its power? You do not possess the ring. Not yet. Saruman's smile widens. But I will. And when I do, we shall see who serves whom in this new age. The confrontation that follows is less dramatic than the histories will record, because the true battles between powers of this magnitude are fought not with sword and flame, but with will and word, and the careful calculation of strength held in reserve. The mouth of Sauron delivers his master's ultimatum: submit or be destroyed, and Saruman provides his response through action rather than speech. He walks to the covered palantir and draws away the silk cloth with ceremonial precision. The seeing stone springs to life beneath his touch, its surface swirling with visions of distant places. But when Sauron's presence reaches through it, seeking contact, Saruman speaks a word of binding, and the stone goes dark. Forever. Tell your master, Saruman says to the lieutenant, who no longer seems quite so terrible in the light of this new reality, that Saruman the White is dead. In his place stands Saruman of many colors, and he serves no master save himself. If the Dark Lord wishes to discuss terms between equals, he knows where to find me. Otherwise, he shrugs with elaborate indifference. Otherwise, he can conduct his little siege without my armies, and we shall see which of us claims the ring first. The mouth of Sauron leaves as he came, through paths that bypass the physical world, but his departure carries a different quality than his arrival. He came as the representative of absolute authority, delivering commands to a subordinate. He leaves as an ambassador, returning to his master with news of rebellion. In the silence that follows, Saruman returns to his window and gazes out over his domain, with eyes that see farther and calculate deeper than they have in centuries. Somewhere to the east, Sauron's armies prepare for a siege that will now be fought with reduced strength and uncertain outcome. Somewhere in the wild lands between here and there, the ring-bearer continues his journey toward a destination that may no longer be under the Dark Lord's absolute control. And here in Isengard, in the Tower of Orthanc, where the first of the Istari once served the purposes of others, a new player enters the game with pieces enough to matter and ambition enough to reshape the board entirely. The war for Middle-earth has become something more complex than anyone anticipated, and in complexity lies opportunity for those wise enough to see it and bold enough to seize it. Saruman of many colors has made his choice, and that choice will echo through everything that follows, changing not just the fate of battles, but the very nature of the conflict itself. From the highest window of Orthanc, the smoke of 10,000 forges rises toward a sky that no longer acknowledges any master's claim to dominion over it. Chapter 6. The Siege of Two Cities. There's a sound that Prince Imrahil has never heard before, echoing through the lower circles of Minas Tirith. The sound of a city holding its breath. Not the hushed whispers of people praying for deliverance, not the muffled sobbing of those who have lost everything they held dear. This is deeper silence, the silence of a population that understands with crystalline clarity that they stand at the edge of extinction, and there may be no dawn after this night. From the walls of the citadel, Imrahil can see the fires of Sauron's army stretching across the Pelennor fields like fallen stars. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, but not the overwhelming host that was promised in the Dark Lord's threats. Intelligence from captured orcs speaks of forces diverted, armies reassigned, entire legions that were supposed to be here but march instead toward other objectives that their interrogators cannot determine. They should have twice this number, Imrahil says to Captain Beregont, as they watch the enemy siege engines roll slowly across the field below. The reports from our agents in the east spoke of forces that would darken the sky. Where are they? Beregont's weathered face shows the strain of days without sleep, of commanding defenses that grow thinner with each passing hour. Does it matter, my lord? What we face here is still more than enough to overwhelm our walls. It's true, and they both know it. Even reduced, Sauron's army numbers perhaps 20,000, orcs and easterlings and southrons mounted on Mumakil, that tower above the battlefield, like walking siege towers. Against them, Minas Tirith can muster perhaps 4,000 fighting men, supplemented by civilians pressed into service with whatever weapons they can find. But there's something in the partial nature of the enemy's strength that creates space for hope, however fragile. If Sauron had brought his full might against them, resistance would have been pointless. Instead, they face an enemy that is strong enough to break them, but not so overwhelming that courage becomes meaningless. "Ready the sortie," Imrahil commands. 500 men, the best we have. We'll hit their siege engines before they can get them into position. It's a desperate gamble, the kind of strategy that only makes sense when all the alternatives lead to certain defeat. But as Imrahil leads his men through the gates of the first circle and charges across the Pelennor fields toward the enemy lines, there's something magnificent in the gesture that transcends its tactical value. They ride not because they expect to win, but because there are things worth dying for, even when dying seems certain. The charge strikes the orc lines like lightning hitting a mountain. Brilliant, devastating, and far too brief. Imrahil's sword cuts through black armor and finds the hearts beneath it. His horse's hooves scatter enemies like leaves before the wind. and for perhaps 10 minutes it seems as though courage alone might be enough to turn the tide. Then the Mumakil arrive. 300 miles northwest of Minas Tirith, in the great hall of Edoras, where the kings of the Mark once held court, Saruman of many colours sits upon a throne that was not built for him, and contemplates the view from his new capital. Through the tall windows, he can see Uruk-hai patrols moving along roads that once carried the swift horses of Rohan, can watch his engineers directing the construction of fortifications that will transform this land from a kingdom of horse lords into something more useful to his purposes. The transformation has been remarkably smooth. With Theoden dead and his army scattered, the remaining population of Rohan offered little resistance to their new masters. Most fled south toward Gondor or east toward the Vold, leaving behind empty villages and abandoned farms that Saruman's forces have turned into supply depots and staging areas. Those who remained have found that cooperation with the White Hand brings food and safety, while resistance brings only death. "My lord," reports Ugluk, the Uruk-hai captain who commanded the assault on Helm's Deep, "the eastern settlements have been secured, the horse herds scattered as you predicted, but we've captured perhaps 1,000 of their finest mounts. Our riders are learning to manage them." Saruman nods approvingly. "The horses of Rohan are too valuable to waste, and too dangerous to leave in enemy hands. Already, his engineers are experimenting with ways to adapt Uruk-hai physiology to mounted warfare, breeding programs that will produce the strength needed to control Rohirric steeds while maintaining the intelligence necessary for complex battlefield tactics. And the resistance? Scattered groups, my lord. Perhaps 500 men, led by that Eomer who survived Helm's Deep. They strike at our supply lines and disappear into the hills, but they lack the numbers to pose any real threat. It's the kind of resistance that Saruman expected, brave, determined, and ultimately futile. Eomer and his survivors can harass patrols and burn supply wagons, but they cannot hold territory or protect the people who once looked to them for protection. They are the last flickers of a flame that is already dying. From the east comes the sound that Saruman has been waiting for, the horns of his scouts returning from their missions beyond Rohan's borders. The reports they bring confirm what he had hoped. Sauron's assault on Minas Tirith proceeds, but slowly, hampered by the absence of forces that were promised but never arrived. The Dark Lord's army is strong enough to besiege Gondor's capital, but not strong enough to overwhelm it quickly. This is the space that Saruman's strategy has created. Time measured in weeks rather than days, room for maneuver that did not exist when the two Dark Lords moved in coordination. While Sauron spends his strength against stone walls and determined defenders, Saruman builds his own kingdom in the west and prepares for the larger conflict that must eventually come. In the Eastfold of Rohan, where the Entwash runs cold and clear between hills that once echoed with the sound of horses running free, Eomer, son of Eomund, crouches beside a stream and tries to understand how everything went so wrong so quickly. 3 weeks ago, he rode as Marshal of the Mark, commanding the finest cavalry in Middle-earth in service to a king who had ruled these lands for more than 60 years. Now he hides in caves and ruins with fewer than 500 men, watching his homeland transform into something he no longer recognizes. The latest reports from his scouts make grim reading. Saruman's engineers have begun construction of a road that will connect Isengard directly to Edoras, cutting through the downs and valleys where Rohirrim children once learned to ride. They're building watchtowers on hilltops that commanded views of the horse herds, turning the landscape itself into a weapon for controlling the remaining population. "We could hit the road builders," suggests Erkenbrand, the old lord of Westfold, who escaped the fall of Helm's Deep with a handful of his men. "Set back their construction by weeks," maybe months. Eomer considers this, weighing the tactical value against the cost. Every raid they launch costs them men they cannot afford to lose. But every day they allow Saruman's fortifications to grow stronger makes eventual liberation that much more difficult. How many guards? Perhaps 50 Uruk-hai, plus workers. We could take them if we move fast and get out before reinforcements arrive. It's the kind of calculation that has defined their resistance since the fall of the Hornburg. Small victories measured against mounting losses, tactical successes that cannot change the strategic reality of their situation. But as Eomer looks at the faces of the men who still follow him, he sees something that makes the mathematics irrelevant. They need to fight not because fighting will win them victory, but because surrender will cost them something more valuable than their lives. The idea of Rohan, the dream of a land where free people ride under open skies, cannot survive in the world that Saruman is building. If that idea dies with them, then everything their fathers and grandfathers fought for becomes meaningless. "We ride at dawn," Eomer says, and watches hope kindle in tired eyes that have seen too much defeat. The war continues on two fronts now, in the siege lines around Minas Tirith, where Prince Imrahil leads desperate sorties against impossible odds, and in the hills of Rohan, where the last riders of the Mark fight to preserve something that may already be lost. Both struggles are bound together by the choices made by powers beyond mortal understanding, by the fracturing of alliances that once seemed eternal. In Minas Tirith, the defenders hold, because Sauron's forces are not quite strong enough to overwhelm them. In Rohan, the resistance continues because Saruman's attention is divided between consolidation and larger ambitions. Neither side can achieve decisive victory, and in that stalemate lies whatever hope remains for the free peoples of Middle-earth. But hope, as those who fight in its name are learning, is a currency that can be spent, but not easily replenished, and the reserves grow thinner with each passing day. Chapter 7. The Hunt for the Ring. There's a sound that Gollum has never made before, echoing through the grey stones of the Emin Muil. The sound of a creature caught between two hungers so profound that choosing between them might tear him apart entirely. Not the wet rasping of his usual speech, not the soft hissing of his arguments with himself. This is something deeper and more desperate. The sound of someone who has spent centuries as the hunter, discovering what it feels like to become the prey. He crouches behind a boulder that time and weather have carved into the shape of a giant's broken tooth, watching the valley below, where Frodo and Sam rest in the shadow of standing stones older than the kingdoms of men. The ring hangs around the ring-bearer's neck like a golden noose, its presence singing through Gollum's bones with the sweet ache of proximity. So close, after decades of searching, after following rumors and whispers across half of Middle-earth, the precious is within reach of his trembling fingers. But they are not alone in these hills anymore. 3 times in the past 2 days, Gollum has spotted the White Hand on black banners moving through the rocky passages below them. Uruk-hai in the colours of Isengard, moving with the systematic precision of hunters who know exactly what they seek. They quarter the ground methodically, leaving stone markers to show which areas they've searched, setting up observation posts on the highest peaks, where their sharp eyes can sweep the landscape for signs of small travellers moving carefully through the wilderness. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to lead his precious hobbits away from this place, to find paths through the marshes or the mountain passes where Saruman's scouts cannot follow. But Gollum has been thinking, and thinking is a dangerous thing for creatures driven by appetites too large for reason to contain. What if he doesn't have to choose between protecting the ring and claiming it? What if there's a third path, one that leads not to the Black Gate of Mordor, where Sauron's forces wait in overwhelming strength, but to a different destination entirely? "Nice hobbits," he whispers to himself, his voice barely audible above the wind that moans through the stone formations. Sméagol knows safe paths. Yes, precious. Paths that avoid the nasty scouts with their sharp swords and hungry eyes. But his voice drops even lower, becomes something like a prayer offered to darkness itself. But what if the scouts could help Sméagol? What if they want the same thing Sméagol wants? The idea has been growing in his mind like poison ivy, sending tendrils through every thought until he can barely think of anything else. Saruman's forces hunt the ring, just as Sauron's do. But Saruman isn't Sauron, and the White Wizard might be willing to make bargains that the Dark Lord would never consider. Trade the hobbits to Isengard, and perhaps Sméagol could convince the wizard to let him keep the ring once it's safely away from those who would destroy it. It's a plan built on hope and desperation in equal measure. But for a creature who has lived for centuries on nothing but hope and desperation, it feels almost reasonable. Down in the valley, Frodo stirs restlessly in his sleep, one hand moving unconsciously to touch the chain around his neck. Even in dreams, the ring calls to him, its weight increasing with every step toward Mordor, until sometimes Sam worries his master might collapse under the burden. But lately there's been something different in the ring's voice, something that speaks not just of the Dark Tower where it was forged, but of other powers that desire it just as strongly. Sam keeps watch while his master sleeps, his hand resting on Sting's hilt, his eyes scanning the horizon for dangers that seem to multiply with every passing hour. The sword's blade has been glowing faintly since they entered these hills, a sure sign that orcs are near. But it's been difficult to tell whether the light grows stronger or weaker as the day progresses. There are so many of them now, scattered across the landscape in patterns that suggest coordination rather than random wandering. "Master Frodo," he whispers, gently shaking his companion awake. "We need to move. Something's not right about this place." Frodo's eyes open slowly, and Sam can see the exhaustion that weighs on him like a physical thing. The ring-bearer has been growing thinner with each passing day, his face taking on the gaunt look of someone carrying a burden too heavy for mortal flesh to bear. But there's still determination in those dark eyes, still the stubborn courage that brought them this far against impossible odds. "What is it, Sam?" Too many scouts about, and they're moving like they're looking for something specific. Sméagol's been acting stranger than usual, too, keeps whispering to himself and looking back the way we came like he's expecting someone to follow us. As if summoned by his name, Gollum appears at Sam's shoulder, with the unsettling silence that has always marked his movements. His pale eyes dart between the hobbits and something he can see in the distance, and his usual servile manner seems strained almost to the breaking point. "Yes, yes, nasty scouts everywhere," he hisses. "But Sméagol knows safe paths, hidden ways through the stone maze where the big folk cannot follow. Come quickly before they see us." There's something in his voice that makes Sam's hand tighten on his sword hilt, but before he can voice his suspicions, the sound of iron-shod boots on stone echoes across the valley. A patrol of Uruk-hai, perhaps a dozen strong, moving along the base of the hills with the measured pace of professional hunters. They carry bows along with their curved swords, and their armor bears not just the white hand of Saruman, but additional markings that speak of specific missions and special authority. Gollum leads them deeper into the maze of standing stones and weathered arches that gives the Emyn Muil its name, following paths that seem random but always trend in the same direction, toward a narrow canyon where the walls rise high enough to hide them from observation, but also high enough to prevent easy escape. Sam's unease grows with each turning, but Frodo seems almost relieved to be moving again, as if motion itself provides some protection against the ring's increasing weight. The trap, when it springs, is almost elegant in its simplicity. One moment they're following what seems like a promising path toward higher ground. The next, they're standing in a blind canyon, with Uruk-hai archers positioned on the cliffs above them, and more emerging from concealed positions among the rocks. 20 of them at least, all bearing the white hand, all with arrows nocked and ready. "Well, well," says their captain, a massive Uruk with scars across his face that speak of many battles survived. "What have we here? 2 little travellers, far from home, and carrying something our Lord Saruman wants very badly." Gollum cringes against the canyon wall, playing his part as the terrified guide caught up in events beyond his control. But Sam can see the calculation in those pale eyes, the way his gaze keeps flicking between the Uruk-hai and the chain around Frodo's neck. Understanding hits him like a physical blow. "You led us here," he says, his voice flat with betrayal. "This whole path was planned." "Sméagol had no choice," Gollum wails. But there's something false in his despair, something that speaks of acting rather than genuine emotion. "The nasty scouts would have found us anyway. At least this way. This way Sméagol can make a bargain. Yes, precious. Keep the ring safe from the eye that burns, safe from the tower that watches." The Uruk captain laughs, a sound like grinding millstones. "Safe? The ring will be safe, creature. Safe in the hands of Saruman the White, who knows its true value and will use it to bring order to this chaotic world. What happens next unfolds with the swift precision of a plan, long in preparation. Arrows fly toward the hobbits, but not to kill. These are nets and weighted bolts designed to capture rather than slay. Sam draws sting and tries to fight their way clear, but against 20 Uruk-hai in perfect position, courage alone is not enough. Then the horn of Gondor sounds from the canyon's mouth, and suddenly the trap becomes something else entirely. Faramir arrives like the storm itself given form, his rangers pouring down the canyon walls with ropes and grappling hooks, their grey cloaks making them almost invisible against the stone until they strike. The battle that follows is brief and brutal, Gondorian steel against Uruk-hai iron, experience against numbers, desperate defense against calculated ambush. When the last of Saruman's scouts lies dead among the standing stones, Faramir helps Frodo to his feet, with hands that shake slightly from the aftermath of combat. "You are unhurt, ring-bearer." "They did not." His eyes move to the chain around Frodo's neck, and understanding passes between them without need for words. "They knew," Frodo says quietly. "Somehow, they knew exactly what I carry and where to find me." Faramir's expression is grim as he surveys the dead Uruk-hai and the canyon that so nearly became their tomb. "The nets tighten, Master Baggins. Saruman's hunters grow bolder and more numerous with each passing day. My rangers report similar patrols throughout Ithilien, all searching for small travellers moving toward Mordor. And they're not the only ones," Sam adds, casting a dark look toward Gollum, who huddles against the canyon wall and refuses to meet anyone's eyes. "Seems we've got enemies closer to home than we thought." But Gollum's betrayal, devastating as it is, pales beside the larger implications of what they've just survived. 2 Dark Lords now hunt the ring with active purpose, their scouts ranging across the borderlands with coordination and intelligence that speaks of resources dedicated specifically to this task. The journey to Mount Doom, always perilous, has become something approaching impossible. As they prepare to leave this place of ambush and betrayal behind, Frodo feels the ring's weight settle more heavily on his shoulders, and for the first time since leaving Rivendell, he wonders if hope itself might be the cruelest burden of all. Chapter 8. The Battle of the Crossroads. There's a sound that the ancient stones of the crossroads have never heard before, echoing through the vale where 4 roads meet, the sound of allies becoming enemies. Not the clash of weapons that has marked so many battles fought across these strategic grounds. Not the war cries of opposing armies meeting in predetermined conflict. This is something stranger and more terrible, the sound of darkness turning upon itself, of powers that once marched in concert, now spilling each other's blood over questions of dominion and precedence. The great stone king that once stood guard over this crossroads lies headless in the morning mist, his crown replaced centuries ago by the grinning skull that marked Sauron's claim to these lands. But even that symbol of the Dark Lord's authority seems diminished now, overshadowed by the white hand banners that snap in the wind above an army that was never supposed to be here. Saruman's forces arrived in the pre-dawn darkness, 3,000 Uruk-hai moving with the silent precision that has made them the most feared warriors in Middle-earth. They occupy the high ground, overlooking the crossroads, their archers positioned to command all 4 approaches, their pikemen formed into squares that could withstand cavalry charges from any direction. It's a deployment that speaks of military genius and careful planning, but also of something more personal, the satisfaction of a trap perfectly laid. The Southrons come with the sunrise, just as Saruman's intelligence predicted they would. 1,000 men of Harad mounted on oliphauns that tower above the battlefield, like walking fortresses, their howdahs bristling with spears and arrows, their trumpeters sounding the advance that should have carried them unopposed to the siege lines around Minas Tirith. Behind them march twice that number of Easterlings in scale armor that gleams like serpent skin in the morning light, their curved swords catching fire from the sun as they advance toward what should have been an empty crossroads. The shock of finding Uruk-hai, where none should be, brings the entire column to a confused halt. Commands are shouted in the harsh tongues of the south and east. Officers ride forward to assess this unexpected obstacle, and for perhaps 10 minutes, the crossroads becomes a tableau of uncertainty, as 2 armies try to understand what the other's presence means. Then Saruman himself appears. He rides down from the high ground on a horse bred in Rohan's pastures, but trained in Isengard's courtyards, his robes of many colors brilliant against the grey morning sky. There's no herald to announce him, no formal parley requested or offered. He simply places himself in the space between the armies and begins to speak, his voice carrying across the vale with the authority of one who has never doubted his right to command. "Men of the South," he calls, and his words seem to reach every ear despite the vast distance involved. You march to serve a master who offers you nothing but the privilege of dying for his ambition. I offer something different, a place in the new order that will rise from the ashes of the old, with rewards proportionate to wisdom rather than blind obedience. The response comes in the form of arrows, a dozen black-fletched shafts that arc through the morning air toward the wizard who dares to challenge the Dark Lord's authority, but they never reach their target. Saruman's staff blazes with light that burns the arrows to ash before they can touch him, and his laughter echoes across the battlefield with the sound of absolute confidence. "I take that as a refusal," he says, and raises his staff in signal to the warriors waiting on the hills above. What follows is not a battle so much as a demonstration of what happens when the world's 2 greatest military minds turn their attention to destroying each other, rather than their common enemies. The Uruk-hai charge down from the heights, like an avalanche given form and purpose, their war cries splitting the morning air as they crash into the Southron formations with the force of falling mountains. But the men of Harad are not defenseless. Their olive-haunts trumpet challenge to the sky and charge to meet the Uruk-hai advance, tusks lowered and howdahs raining arrows on everything below them. The impact when the two forces meet is like thunder made solid, the sound of bodies breaking against armor, of weapons finding flesh, of creatures bred for war, discovering what it means to face enemies equally committed to victory. From the eastern approach, the Easterlings attempt to flank Saruman's position, but they find their path blocked by Uruk-hai reserves that seem to anticipate their every movement. The White Wizard has studied his enemies well, has learned their tactics, and prepared counters for every strategy they might employ. Where they expect to find weakness, they discover strength. Where they hope to achieve surprise, they meet disciplined formations that turn their own momentum against them. 20 miles north of the crossroads, Frodo Baggins crouches behind a fallen tree and listens to the sound of his enemies destroying each other. The noise of battle carries clearly on the morning wind, the clash of weapons, the screams of dying men and beasts, the horn calls that speak of charges and retreats and desperate last stands. It should be a joyful sound to ears that have heard too many war cries raised against the free peoples. But instead, Frodo feels only a deeper despair settling over him, like winter fog. "They're fighting each other, Mr. Frodo," Sam says, his voice carrying a wonder that Frodo cannot share. "The enemy's turned on itself. Surely that's good news for us." But Frodo has begun to understand something that chills him more than the proximity of Mordor or the weight of the ring around his neck. The battle raging at the crossroads is being fought over him, over the prize he carries, and regardless of who wins, the victor will emerge stronger and more determined than before. Whether Saruman's tactical brilliance prevails, or Sauron's numerical superiority overwhelms the rebellion, the ring will still be hunted, the net will still be closing, and his chances of reaching Mount Doom grow smaller with each passing hour. But there is opportunity in chaos, and chaos is exactly what the battle at the crossroads provides. While Saruman's forces engage Sauron's reinforcements in savage combat, while both armies commit their attention to destroying each other rather than hunting ring-bearers, the Morgul Pass lies temporarily unguarded. It's a narrow window, perhaps only hours wide, but it may be the only chance they will get. "Come on, Sam," Frodo says, shouldering his pack with grim determination. "While they're busy killing each other, we need to keep moving." 50 miles south of the crossroads, in the throne room of Minas Tirith, where the banners of the reunited kingdom hang bright with hope restored, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, studies the reports that his scouts bring from the borderlands and begins to understand that the war has changed in ways that create possibilities no one had dared to hope for. "How many engaged?" he asks Captain Beregond, who commands the intelligence network that reaches deep into enemy territory. "At least 4,000, my lord. Perhaps half of Saruman's remaining strength, and a significant portion of the reinforcements that were meant to break our siege lines. They've been fighting for 3 hours now, and neither side shows any sign of yielding." Aragorn moves to the great map table, where the disposition of forces across Middle-earth is marked with colored pins and ribbons. The sight that greets him is one that would have been unthinkable a week ago. 2 separate concentrations of enemy strength, isolated from each other and actively hostile, neither able to support the other in the campaigns that have defined this war. Sauron's siege falters without those reinforcements, he observes, tracing the lines of supply and support that connect Mordor to the armies besieging his city. And Saruman weakens himself with every hour this battle continues, regardless of whether he wins or loses. An opportunity, my lord? More than that, Aragorn says, and his voice carries the weight of decisions that will reshape the fate of Middle-earth. A chance to strike while our enemy's attention is divided. Prepare the army. We ride for the crossroads within the hour. The battle continues through the long day. Uruk-hai steel against Southron bronze, wizard fire against Oliphaunt fury, tactical brilliance against numerical superiority. When the sun sets over the crossroads, it illuminates a field strewn with the dead of both armies, the ancient stones stained with blood that will take centuries to wash away. Saruman's forces hold the field, but at a cost that even the wizard's calculating mind had not fully anticipated. Half his army lies dead among the rocks and ruins, his remaining strength barely sufficient to garrison the territory he has claimed in Rohan. The victory is real but hollow, a demonstration of power that has left him weaker rather than stronger. But in the growing darkness, as his surviving Uruk-hai begin the grim work of counting their dead, Saruman allows himself a moment of cold satisfaction. Sauron's reinforcements will not reach Minas Tirith, the siege will falter, and in that failure lies the space for new strategies and larger ambitions. The ring-bearer continues his journey toward Mount Doom, but that journey leads through territories that are no longer under unified enemy control. The war continues, but its shape has changed forever in the blood-soaked vale where four roads meet. And in that change, however costly, lies whatever hope remains for those who still believe that darkness need not be eternal. Chapter 9. The Last Alliance Reformed. There's a sound that the throne room of Minas Tirith has not heard for 3,000 years echoing through its vaulted halls. The sound of oaths sworn not to a steward keeping faith with absent kings, but to a king returned at last to claim his inheritance. Not the careful formulas of temporary allegiance that have bound Gondor's nobility to its ruling stewards, not the conditional promises that could be withdrawn if circumstances changed. These are the old oaths, the ones that bind men's souls to something larger than themselves and make them willing to die for causes that may outlive their children's children. Aragorn, son of Arathorn, stands before the throne of his fathers, wearing mail that bears the scars of a dozen battles, the crown of Elendil upon his brow and Anduril at his side, and every man who looks upon him understands that something fundamental has changed in the world. Not just the replacement of one ruler with another, but the restoration of continuity that was broken long ago, the return of authority that carries the weight of ages behind it. Prince Imrahil kneels before the throne with the easy grace of one whose loyalty has never wavered, and when he speaks the ancient words of fealty, his voice carries across the hall with the certainty of stone foundations finally given a castle to support. My sword and my strength, my counsel and my blood, from this day until the last day. The response comes from every throat in the great hall, not just the nobles and captains who have gathered here, but the common soldiers and citizens who have crowded into the galleries to witness this moment. We hear and we remember. The words are ritual, but the voices that speak them carry something more than ceremony. Hope, the recognition that the scattered forces of the free peoples now have a focal point around which they can gather, a symbol that can unite them against the darkness that has divided itself and grown weaker in the division. But symbols alone cannot win wars, and Aragorn knows that the crown on his head means nothing if he cannot transform it into the strength needed to preserve what it represents. The reports from his scouts tell a story of opportunity balanced on the knife's edge of disaster. Saruman's forces weakened by their battle at the crossroads, but still holding Rohan. Sauron's siege, reduced in strength, but far from broken. And everywhere the signs that time is running short for decisive action. "How many can we muster?" he asks Lord Commander Hurin, who has served as the military backbone of Gondor's resistance through the darkest hours of the siege. 5,000 from Minas Tirith itself, perhaps 2,000 more from the outer provinces if we strip the garrisons. Prince Imrahil can bring another 1,000 from Dol Amroth. Hurin pauses, his weathered face showing the strain of commanding forces that have been stretched beyond their limits for weeks. But my lord, even 7,000 or 8,000 men cannot hope to challenge armies that number in the tens of thousands. Not alone, Aragorn agrees, but we will not be alone. He moves to the great map table, where the disposition of forces across Middle-earth is marked in pins and ribbons that tell a story more complex than any war Gondor has fought in living memory. 2 enemy armies, hostile to each other and bleeding from their mutual conflict. Scattered groups of free peoples, disorganized by defeat, but still fighting in a dozen different locations, and threading through it all a network of alliances and obligations that the return of the king has activated, like sparks jumping between dry tinder. Riders have already gone north, Aragorn continues, his finger tracing paths across the map that speak of coordination on a scale not seen since the last alliance. Ioma still holds the eastern marches of Rohan, with perhaps 500 cavalry. The Ents may have refused to march to war, but they will not oppose our passage through their borders. And there are other powers in this world that have grown weary of sitting in council while darkness spreads across the lands they love. As if summoned by his words, the great doors of the throne room open to admit a figure that makes every man present question what he knows about the boundaries between legend and reality. Legolas Greenleaf enters with the measured grace that marks all his kindred, but behind him comes something unprecedented in the halls of Gondor, a delegation of elven lords from realms that most men know only through ancient songs. "Thranduil King sends word," Legolas says, his clear voice carrying easily across the vast hall. "The woodland realm will ride to war once more, as we did in the days when Gil-galad held the high kingship. 2,000 spears and twice as many bows, if the returned king will have them." The silence that follows is not uncertainty, but awe. For 3,000 years the elves have withdrawn from the wars of men, retreating to their hidden realms and leaving the younger races to face the darkness alone. But the return of Isildur's heir has awakened something in the hearts of the firstborn, some memory of duty that transcends the weariness of ages. "And from Lothlorien," adds a voice, like silver bells in wind, as Galadriel's messenger steps forward with the fluid motion of water given form. The lady sends word that her guardians will march under the starlight, 500 of the Galadrim who have not drawn sword in anger for 1,000 years. The Golden Wood remembers its debts to the blood of Númenor. But it's the third announcement that transforms possibility into certainty, that changes everything the assembled lords thought they knew about the forces available to them. Aragorn himself makes this revelation, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that will echo through the histories yet to be written. "There is another path to victory," he says, and something in his tone makes every man lean forward despite himself. The paths of the dead lie open to those with the courage to walk them, and at their end waits an army that has hungered for release for 3,000 years. The tale he tells then is one that belongs in the songs of heroes rather than the council chambers of living men, of oaths broken and curses pronounced, of the dead who swore to fight against the shadow and failed at their moment of testing, condemned to endure until a rightful king should come to claim their service. It's a story that most of his audience knows only as legend, but when Aragorn speaks of walking the dark door and facing the king of the dead in his ghostly halls, every word carries the ring of lived truth. They answered when I called, he continues, his hand moving unconsciously to the hilt of the sword that marked his right to make such a call. 5,000 spirits, bound by oath and honor, seeking the rest that only victory can provide. They march even now toward the southern ports where Sauron's black ships gather, and when they have dealt with that threat, they will join us in the field. What follows is not debate, but a kind of collective awakening, as lords and captains who have spent weeks calculating impossible odds suddenly find themselves contemplating strategies that might actually succeed. 12,000 men from Gondor and Dol Amroth, 500 surviving Rohirrim under Eomer's command, mounted on horses that can cover ground faster than any infantry. 2,500 elves from realms that most thought had passed beyond caring about the fates of mortal lands. 5,000 dead, seeking redemption through service to the rightful king. 20,000 warriors united under a single banner for the first time since the last alliance itself. The enemy's forces are divided, Aragorn says, his voice carrying the authority of one who has seen the possibilities and chosen among them. Sauron's army around Minas Tirith weakens daily without reinforcement. Saruman's strength is reduced by half after the Crossroads battle. For the first time since this war began, we have the opportunity to defeat them in detail rather than facing their combined might. Which do we strike first? Prince Imrahil asks, and his tone suggests a man already committed to whatever answer comes. Both, Aragorn replies, and his smile carries something that his enemies would recognize as danger given visible form. Saruman's weakened forces cannot hold Rohan against a coordinated assault, especially if Eomer's cavalry strikes from within while our main force approaches from without. And once Rohan is liberated, we turn east with the full strength of the reunited West to break the siege of our city. The plan that emerges from their council is ambitious beyond anything Gondor has attempted in living memory, but it's built on foundations of hope rather than desperation. For the first time since the shadow began to lengthen across Middle-earth, the free peoples will fight with unified command and coordinated strategy, their scattered strength gathered into something that can challenge even the might of the Dark Lords. As the council disperses and the great work of preparation begins, Aragorn remains in the throne room with its maps and banners, and the weight of decisions that will determine whether the Third Age ends in darkness or dawn. Somewhere to the east, the Ring-Bearer continues his journey toward Mount Doom, carrying a burden that grows heavier with each step. But he no longer travels through a world where hope is a luxury the free peoples cannot afford. The last alliance has been reformed, and this time it marches to war with the knowledge that the enemy's strength is divided and their own unity restored. Chapter 10. The White Tower's Gambit. There's a sound that Mount Doom has never heard before, echoing through the Sammath Naur, the sound of a wizard's laughter, mixing with the roar of the fires that forged the world. Not the mad cackling of minds broken by power too great to contain. Not the bitter amusement of those who have found cruel humor in others' suffering. This is something far more dangerous, the laughter of absolute certainty, of a mind that has calculated every possibility and found them all leading to the same inevitable conclusion. Saruman of many colors stands at the entrance to the chamber of fire, with his staff blazing white against the hellish glow of the lava below, and for the first time in centuries, he allows himself to feel something approaching joy. Behind him lies the wreckage of strategies abandoned and armies left leaderless. Rohan emptied of its Uruk-hai garrisons, Isengard stripped of its remaining defenders, every carefully laid plan sacrificed to this single moment of opportunity that will never come again. Before him, perhaps 20 paces across the narrow ledge that leads to the cracks of doom themselves, 3 small figures huddle in the heat shimmer rising from the chasm where the ring was born. The ring-bearer, exhausted beyond endurance by the weight of the burden he has carried so far and the proximity of its source, his faithful companion, sword drawn but trembling with fatigue and despair, and between them, crouched like some pale spider ready to strike, the creature whose obsession with the ring has made him both guide and betrayer throughout this impossible journey. "Well met, ring-bearer," Saruman calls, his voice carrying easily over the thunder of molten rock. "Though I confess, I had expected to find you here alone, or perhaps with only your gardener for company. I did not anticipate that Smeagol would prove so persistent in his devotions." Frodo turns toward the sound of the wizard's voice, with movements that speak of strength pushed beyond its breaking point, and when he lifts his head, Saruman can see the toll that carrying the ring has taken on him. The hobbit's face is gaunt with exhaustion, his eyes hollowed by burdens no mortal was meant to bear, but there's still something unbroken in his gaze that speaks of will hardened in fires that would have destroyed lesser souls. "Saruman," Frodo says, and his voice carries neither surprise nor fear, only a kind of weary recognition. "I wondered when you would come yourself. Did you think I would leave such a prize to subordinates?" The wizard begins to move along the ledge with the careful pace of one who knows that haste here could mean death for all of them. "Did you imagine that I would trust the claiming of ultimate power to creatures bred for war rather than wisdom? No, young Baggins. Some tasks require a personal touch." Sam steps protectively in front of his master, sting gleaming blue in his hands as it responds to the presence of enemies beyond counting. But his gaze keeps flicking between Saruman and Gollum, recognizing that the immediate threat may not be the wizard who approaches with measured steps, but the creature who has brought them this far only to betray them at the moment of ultimate decision. "You're too late," Sam says, his voice carrying more confidence than his situation warrants. "Mr. Frodo's going to destroy that cursed thing, and there's nothing you or anyone else can do to stop him." Saruman's smile is cold enough to freeze summer. Destroy it? Here, in the fires where it was made, with its power singing through his very bones? My dear Samwise, do you have any idea what you're asking of him? The truth of those words hangs in the air like smoke, because everyone on the ledge understands what Frodo himself has been trying not to acknowledge throughout the long climb up Mount Doom's smoking slopes. The ring's power here, so close to its source, is not diminished, but magnified beyond anything he has experienced before. Every step closer to the cracks of doom makes it heavier around his neck, makes its voice louder in his thoughts, makes the idea of casting it into the fires seem not like salvation, but like the destruction of everything he has ever valued. "I can feel it, you know," Saruman continues, his voice taking on the hypnotic quality that has bent stronger wills than Frodo's to his purpose. The ring calls out, seeking a master worthy of its power. It whispers of the good that could be done with such strength, the suffering that could be prevented, the order that could be imposed upon this chaotic world. Why destroy such a tool when it could be used for righteous purposes? It's the same temptation that has haunted Frodo since Rivendell, but magnified now beyond mortal endurance by the proximity of the fires below, and the desperate circumstances that have brought them all to this place. The ring pulls at him with the weight of falling mountains, its golden surface warm against his chest, its voice promising relief from every burden if he will only claim it as his own. But it's Gollum who breaks the spell of Saruman's words, launching himself across the narrow space between them with the desperate fury of a creature who has spent centuries seeking this moment and will not see it stolen by others. His pale hands reach for Frodo's throat, his eyes blazing with an obsession that has consumed everything else he once was, his voice raised in a wail that speaks of loss beyond the power of words to express. No, the precious is ours. Ours. We won't let the wizard thing take it. We won't let anyone take it. What follows is not a battle, but a kind of dance, performed on the edge of eternity. 4 figures moving in patterns of desire and desperation, while the fires of the earth roar beneath them. Gollum grapples with Frodo for control of the ring. Sam strikes at both Gollum and the approaching Saruman with Sting's blue flame, and the wizard himself calls upon powers that make the air shimmer with heat that has nothing to do with the lava below. Enough! Saruman's voice carries the authority of ages, and his staff blazes with light that forces all of them to shield their eyes. The ring has caused suffering enough. Let it serve the cause of order at last, in hands that understand its proper use. But as he reaches for the golden circle that hangs around Frodo's neck, as his fingers close upon the metal that has shaped the fate of ages, something happens that none of them anticipated. The ring responds not to his will or wisdom, but to the simple, desperate desire of the creature who has loved it longest and most completely. Gollum's teeth find their mark in Frodo's finger, and the ring-bearer's cry of pain echoes through the chamber of fire as his hand opens involuntarily. The ring falls, spinning in the hellish light, and for a moment it hangs in the air between them, like a golden star born from their combined longing. Then Gollum catches it, clutches it to his chest with the ecstasy of reunion, and steps backward in his triumph, straight off the narrow ledge and into the cracks of doom that have waited 3,000 years to reclaim what came from them. Saruman's scream of rage and loss follows Gollum and the ring into the fires below, a sound that speaks of plans that spanned a centuries destroyed in a single moment of careless exultation. The wizard lunges forward, as if he might somehow retrieve what has been lost, but the heat drives him back, and when the ring touches the lava that gave it birth, the explosion of light and force sends all of them tumbling across the stone floor of the Samath Naur. For a moment that might be heartbeats or centuries, the chamber of fire fills with radiance that burns without heat, sound without noise, a presence that encompasses every ring of power ever forged and draws them all into a unity that was always meant to be temporary. The 9 rings of mortal men, the 7 rings of the dwarf lords, the 3 rings of the elven kings, all of them connected by invisible threads of power to the one ring that commanded them all. And when that connection breaks, when the master ring dissolves in fires that remember the music of creation, the sound that follows is not destruction, but silence. The silence of a world where the greatest weapon ever forged has finally been unmade. Saruman lies sprawled on the stones of Mount Doom, his robe singed by fires that burn beyond the physical, his staff cracked and darkened by the backlash of power that no mortal frame was meant to channel. When he lifts his head, His eyes hold the look of one who has glimpsed ultimate victory, only to see it turn to ash in his hands. "It is finished," he whispers, and the words carry both defeat and something that might, in different circumstances, be called relief. The game he has played for centuries is over. The prize he sought is destroyed, and for the first time since he first took the white robes of his order, Saruman the Wise has no idea what comes next. But on the other side of the chamber, Frodo Baggins sits with his back against the stone wall and watches the fires of Mount Doom begin to dim as the power that fed them for so long finally gutters out. The ring is gone, destroyed at last, and with it the weight that has bent his shoulders and darkened his thoughts since he first learned what burden he had inherited from his cousin. Yet victory, when it comes, tastes more like ash than joy, and the silence that fills the Sammath Naur speaks not of triumph, but of emptiness, the hollow echo of power unmade and purposes fulfilled at a cost that none of them had truly understood until this moment. Chapter 11. The Fire and the Void. There's a sound that darkness makes when it loses its center, not the crash of fortresses falling or the wail of armies in retreat, but something deeper and more unsettling, the sound of power that has defined itself by unity, suddenly learning what it means to be scattered. It echoes across Middle-earth in the moments after the ring touches the lava of Mount Doom, a vibration that travels not through air or stone, but through the hidden connections that bind all things touched by the shadow to their source. In Barad-dûr, the dark tower that has stood unconquered for 3,000 years, Sauron feels the moment of his creation's destruction like a blade thrust through his essence. But where in other tellings this might have meant the complete dissolution of his power, here something different happens. Something that speaks to the choices he has made and the prices he has paid for dividing his attention between too many enemies. The eye that burns atop the tower flickers but does not fail. The will that has commanded armies across half of Middle-earth staggers but does not break. When the shockwave of the ring's destruction passes through him, Sauron discovers that the power he invested in hunting Saruman, in maintaining separate commands for separate campaigns, has created a kind of buffer against total catastrophe. He is diminished, severely weakened, reduced to perhaps a tenth of what he was at the height of his strength. But he endures. In the throne room where the mouth of Sauron once delivered ultimatums to rebellious servants, the Dark Lord himself appears, not as the burning eye that has been his aspect for so long, but in a form more ancient and terrible, a shape that remembers what he was before the ring gave him dominion over all other rings of power. Tall and terrible in armor that seems to drink light from the air around it, his face hidden behind a helm wrought with symbols that hurt to perceive directly. "So," he says, and his voice carries the weight of ages spent learning what it costs to lose what you have spent centuries building. "The precious is unmade, and with it the greater part of my strength. But not all. Never all." His gauntleted hand closes on the arm of his throne, and the metal screams under the pressure. Saruman's rebellion has cost me much, but it has also taught me the value of contingencies. 300 miles west, in the industrial heart of Isengard, where the forges have burned without rest for decades, those contingencies begin to reveal themselves in ways that speak to planning and preparation beyond what any of the free peoples suspected. The great machines that have produced arms and armor for Saruman's armies do not simply stop when word comes that their master has fallen at Mount Doom. Instead, they continue their work under the guidance of lesser minds, Uruk-hai engineers and enslaved men who know only that the work must continue, that the production schedules must be met regardless of who claims dominion over what they create. But without Saruman's will to guide them, without the wizard's intelligence to coordinate their efforts and direct their output toward specific strategic goals, the great industrial complex that has made Isengard the most feared military power in the West begins to turn its strength against itself. Competing factions of Uruk-hai commanders claim authority over different sectors of the operation. Supply lines break down as no one possesses the overall knowledge needed to maintain them. Quality control collapses as the craftsmen who understood the finer points of metallurgy and engineering find themselves taking orders from warriors who know how to use weapons, but not how to make them. The white hand that once flew proudly over Orthanca's spire lies trampled in the courtyard mud, and the armies that once marched under it scatter like leaves before an autumn wind. Some flee toward the mountains, seeking caves and strongholds where they might wait out whatever comes next. Others turn to banditry, using their military training to prey upon the scattered settlements of Rohan. A few, those with intelligence enough to recognize the changed nature of the world they inhabit, begin the long march toward Mordor and whatever service the diminished Dark Lord might still have to offer. 50 miles north of the dying forges, in the ruins of what was once Edoras, Eomer, son of Eomund, stands among the abandoned halls of his fathers and tries to understand what victory looks like when it comes at such a cost. The reports from his scouts paint a picture of Rohan slowly bleeding back to life as Saruman's garrisons abandon their posts, but it's a wounded land that may take generations to heal completely. The horses are returning, reports Elfhild, one of the few riders who survived both Helm's Deep and the guerrilla war that followed. Wild herds coming down from the mountains where they fled when the White Hand claimed the Downs. But they're wary, Master Eomer. It will take time to gentle them again. Time we may not have, Eomer replies, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon, where smoke still rises from Mordor's borders. The ring is destroyed, yes, but the Dark Lord endures, diminished but not defeated. And without Saruman to divide his attention, he doesn't finish the thought, because they all understand what it means. Sauron's remaining strength, however reduced, will no longer be split between multiple campaigns and conflicting objectives. It will be focused, concentrated, directed toward whatever final gambit a cornered enemy might attempt. From the south comes the sound that every survivor of these long weeks of warfare has been waiting to hear. The horn calls of Gondor's cavalry riding north under the banner of the reunited kingdom. Aragorn leads them, his army swollen by the addition of elven spears and the ghostly strength of the Oathbreakers. But there's something different in the way they move across the landscape. Not the urgent advance of forces racing toward a decisive battle, but the measured march of an army that understands it faces not climax, but continuation. When the king reaches Edoras and surveys what remains of the Horse Lord's ancient capital, his expression carries the weight of victories that feel more like postponements than triumphs. The ring is destroyed, he tells the gathered commanders, and his voice should carry joy, but instead holds only grim determination. But our work is not finished. Perhaps it never will be. The strategy that emerges from their war council is one that none of them would have contemplated a month ago. Not the swift campaign to crush a weakened enemy, but the long, careful work of containing a threat that may persist for generations. Sauron's reduced strength makes him less capable of overwhelming assault, but also more likely to resort to the kind of patient, persistent malice that can wear down the strongest defenses given enough time. We fortify, Aragorn continues, his finger tracing lines on maps that show a Middle-earth forever changed by the events of the past weeks. We build strong points along Mordor's borders and staff them with forces that can respond to whatever emerges from the Black Land. We prepare not for a single battle, but for the long watch that may define the rest of our lives. It's not the ending that any of them had hoped for when they first took up arms against the Shadow, but it may be the best ending available to them. The great evil that threatened to overwhelm all the free peoples has been reduced to manageable proportions, contained within borders that can be watched and guarded. The industrial might that gave Saruman's rebellion its strength has collapsed into chaos and infighting. The ring that bound all other rings of power to a single will has been unmade forever. But victory, when it comes at last, tastes of ash and iron rather than wine and celebration, and the silence that settles over the battlefields of Rohan speaks not of peace, but of exhaustion, the weariness of peoples who have learned that some enemies cannot be destroyed, only endured. In the Samath Nor, where 3 small figures wait for rescue among the cooling stones of Mount Doom, Frodo Baggins sits with his back against the chamber wall and feels the absence of the ring's weight like a phantom limb. The burden is gone, lifted at last after months of carrying what no mortal should bear, but the relief he expected has been replaced by something more complex, a kind of emptiness that speaks to how much of himself he invested in the quest that has finally ended. "Is it over, Mr. Frodo?" Sam asks, his voice barely audible over the settling sounds of the mountain that no longer burns with the fires of creation. "Part of it," Frodo replies, and his words carry the weight of someone who has seen too much to believe in simple endings. "The ring is gone, and that was always the most important thing. But the world it leaves behind," he shrugs, a gesture that encompasses everything they have witnessed and everything they have yet to discover. "That world will be what we make of it. And in that making, in the long work of building something worth preserving from the ruins of what was lost, perhaps there lies a different kind of victory than the one they had originally sought, harder won, more fragile, but ultimately more honest about the true costs of standing against the dark." Chapter 12. The Age of Vigilance. There's a sound that peace makes when it comes with conditions attached, not the joyful silence of enemies vanquished and dangers ended, but something more complex and uncertain, the sound of sentries taking their posts for watches that may last lifetimes. It echoes through the rebuilt halls of Minas Tirith as spring gives way to summer, through the recovering pastures of Rohan, where new colts run beside their mothers, through every settlement and stronghold, where the free peoples gather to celebrate victories that feel more like postponements than triumphs. 6 months have passed since the ring fell into the fires of Mount Doom, 6 months of rebuilding and recovery, and the slow, careful work of learning what the world looks like when its greatest threat has been diminished, but not destroyed. In the throne room of Gondor's capital, King Elisar stands before a map table that shows a Middle-earth transformed by war and marked by the ongoing necessity of constant watchfulness. The borders of Mordor are ringed now with fortresses that didn't exist when Sauron commanded the full strength of his malice, watchtowers staffed by the most experienced veterans of the war, signal fires ready to carry word of any movement beyond the Black Gate, garrisons equipped not for swift victory, but for the long endurance that may define the rest of the age. It's a defensive network built on the assumption that the enemy behind those borders will never sleep, never rest, never stop seeking opportunities to reclaim what was lost when the ring was destroyed. "The latest reports, my lord," says Beregond, presenting scrolls sealed with the marks of a dozen different commanders. From all sectors along the Efelduth and the Ash Mountains. No major movements, but the same pattern continues. Probing attacks, scouting parties that test our responses and withdraw before they can be engaged decisively. Aragorn unrolls the reports with hands that have learned to find patterns in what others might dismiss as random harassment. 3 months of such incidents have taught him to read the intelligence like a language, to understand what Sauron's reduced but persistent attention means for those who must guard against it. "He's learning," the king says quietly, "adapting to his diminished strength, finding new ways to apply pressure without committing to battles he might lose. This isn't the behavior of a defeated enemy. This is someone adjusting his strategy to changed circumstances. It's the truth that defines everything about the world they've inherited from their victory at Mount Doom. The understanding that some evils cannot be destroyed, only contained, and that containment requires vigilance without end. The great armies that once threatened to overwhelm all resistance have been scattered, but in their place has come something perhaps more insidious. The patient malice of an enemy who has learned to work within limitations and may prove more dangerous for being forced to think rather than simply overpower. 100 leagues northwest, in the great hall of Edoras, where the banners of the Mark once again fly above the seat of kings, Eomer King sits with the lords of Rohan and contemplates maps that show the slow healing of a land that bears scars which may never fully fade. The White Hand no longer flies over the hills and valleys that his people have called home for generations, but its mark remains in ways that speak to occupation's lasting damage. "The herds grow stronger," reports Erkenbrand, Lord of Westfold, whose own holdings bore the worst of Saruman's industrial attention. "But we've lost bloodlines that took centuries to develop, horses whose ancestry ran back to the days of Eorl himself. That knowledge, that genetic heritage, it's gone, and no amount of rebuilding will restore it." "And the people?" Eomer asks, though he already knows the answer will carry its own weight of loss. "Scattered to the winds, many of them. Some have returned to their holdings, but others—" Erkenbrand shrugs in the way of men who have seen too much to believe in easy recoveries. "Others found new lives in Gondor, or the Shire, or wherever they could make homes when the White Hand claimed their ancestral lands. They're not coming back, and we can't blame them for choosing certainty over the hope that this peace will last." The conversation that follows is one that plays out in similar forms throughout the recovering West. The reckoning of costs that cannot be measured in simple tallies of dead and wounded. The understanding that some damage reaches beyond the material into the realm of trust and tradition, and the 1,000 small certainties that make a culture viable. Rohan endures, will continue to endure, but as something different from what it was before Saruman's rebellion reshaped it according to his vision of industrial efficiency. In the Shire, where the seasons turn as they always have, and the hobbits tend gardens that know nothing of the great events that have shaped the world beyond their borders, Frodo Baggins sits by his window in Bag End and tries to write letters that explain what cannot be explained to friends who were never meant to understand such burdens. The words come slowly, each sentence a struggle to find language that can bridge the gap between the innocence he once shared with them and the knowledge that now defines every moment of his existence. "Dear Sam," he writes, then stops, staring at the name that carries so much weight and wondering how to tell his dearest friend what he has begun to suspect about the true cost of their victory. Sam has returned to his garden and his marriage, and the simple satisfactions that make hobbit life worth living. But Frodo finds himself unable to settle back into patterns that once gave his days meaning and structure. The ring is gone, destroyed forever in the fires where it was born, but the space it once occupied seems to have left a wound that will not heal. Not the physical weight around his neck, but something deeper. The sense of purpose that came from bearing the greatest burden in Middle-earth, the terrible certainty that his choices mattered in ways that shaped the fate of everything he held dear. Without that burden, without the clarity it provided about what needed to be done and what price needed to be paid, he drifts through days that feel simultaneously too long and too short, watching the seasons change from his window and wondering what role former ring-bearers play in a world that no longer needs them to save it, but may need them to remember what salvation cost. The letter remains unfinished on his desk, joining dozens of others that begin with words of greeting and end with silence, and in that accumulation of things left unsaid lies perhaps the truest accounting of what victory has meant for those who paid its price. At the Grey Havens, where the ships of the Eldar have carried the firstborn beyond the circles of the world for centuries uncounted, Gandalf the White stands on the quay and contemplates a departure that has been postponed, but not cancelled. The Astari's task in Middle-earth was to guide the Free Peoples in their resistance to the Shadow, and that task continues as long as any shadow remains to be resisted. "You could come," he says to Elrond, who has delayed his own sailing to help establish the new protocols that will govern how the remaining wise deal with Sauron's persistent but diminished threat. "Your wisdom would be welcome in the uttermost west, and you have earned whatever peace lies beyond the sea." Elrond's smile carries the weight of choices that reflect not weariness, but renewed purpose. Peace will come in its own time, Mithrandir. For now, there is work to be done here. The establishment of communication networks between the watchtowers, the training of new generations in the lore needed to recognize and counter whatever strategies our diminished enemy might devise. The Third Age continues, and it will need the wisdom of those who remember how easily the darkness can grow when good people stop paying attention. It's a conversation that defines the new reality they all inhabit, not the clean ending that victory might have brought in other circumstances, but the complex beginning of an age that will be defined by vigilance rather than celebration, by the understanding that freedom's price is not paid once, but continuously, by every generation that chooses to maintain the watch rather than assume the danger has passed. The ships that might have carried the ring-bearers and the bearers of the Three to their reward in the west remain moored at the Grey Havens, their departure postponed indefinitely, while their passengers tend to responsibilities that have grown rather than diminished with the ring's destruction. It's not the ending any of them would have chosen, but it may be the ending that Middle-earth needs, the commitment of those who understand the true cost of complacency, to remain and ensure that the lessons learned in this long war are not forgotten when memory fades and new generations arise. As summer deepens into autumn and the first year since the ring's destruction draws toward its close, a different kind of story begins to take shape across the recovering lands of the West. Not the tale of heroes who saved the world and lived happily ever after, but the more complex narrative of people who saved what could be saved and committed themselves to protecting it for as long as strength and will endure. In Minas Tirith, scribes work by candlelight to record not just the great deeds of the war, but the smaller details of how watch schedules are maintained and supply lines secured, building the institutional knowledge that will allow future generations to continue the vigil without having to relearn everything through bitter experience. In Edoras, the young riders of the Mark practice not just the cavalry charges that made their ancestors famous, but the patient arts of reconnaissance and communication that will allow them to respond quickly to threats that may not reveal themselves until too late. In the Shire, hobbits who never sought to become part of larger stories begin to understand that sometimes the larger stories come to you whether you seek them or not, and that the price of keeping gardens safe may be eternal willingness to listen for news from beyond the borders of what you can see from your own door. And in all the lands where the free peoples make their homes, the children born in this first year of the New Age will grow up with lullabies that speak not of evil vanquished forever, but of heroes who stand guard while the innocent sleep, and of the ongoing need for new heroes to take up that watch when the old ones can no longer keep it. It's not the ending that anyone would have written by choice, but it may be the most honest ending available, the recognition that some victories are not destinations, but beginnings, and that the age of vigilance, however long it lasts, will be defined not by the absence of darkness, but by the presence of those willing to stand against whatever darkness remains.